All right. So far in the story, there was a thief who she was kind of small. I forgot her name, but there was a big man named Goran, and they had like a huge feud. And Lieutenant Cage kind of fixed the feud, but then the ship's psyker, who like they have like this third eye that took off its bandana and went crazy and started like turning people crazy and inside out. And so Cage like stared at the third eye and he saw horizons beyond horizons, but his mind didn't break. And Goran and that small lady both died with their rib cages like exploding over each other. So it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of poetic. Their camaraderie is a different sort of caliber. After Great is dismissed and we're led back through Mannheim Station, we have a few hours in one of the bunk rooms before the colonel pays us a visit. He tells us to get ready to embark. He leads us onto a different docking area where we file on board at an intra-system transport no roomier than our previous berths were. But there is a bed apiece this time, since there are no warp energies taking up half the length of the ship. I bump into Erasmus Spooge as we head to the war room to see the colonel. "You're coming with us?" I say as the pudgy little man smiles at me. "Well, I'm responsible for your stores, aren't I?" he says. The servo skull buzzes up from behind him, vibrating slightly. "I have to stay with him until they're accounted for, don't I?" "Is that all right?" I ask, looking at the quill skull. "Hmm?" says Spooge, glancing at the autoscribe with a look of concern. "Oh, yes. Do you think I should have the tech priest look at it before we leave?" "Might be a good idea," I say, stepping past him and continuing down the corridor. I hear him tramp off as I knock on the door of the wardroom, hoping to get hold of the colonel. Hearing a voice, I open the door to find the colonel and the ship's captain inside. "We have to wait for the escorts." "Captain Heinz Linger, this is Lieutenant Cage," Schaefer says, nodding in my direction. I give them both a salute. "All aboard, kit stowed, sir." "Already?" says Captain Linger. "Lieutenant Cage has a way of motivating the troops," says Schaefer. "As you have heard, we are now ready to depart." "So what is the delay, Captain?" "The Victorious was having reactor trouble, Captain," Linger explains. "We will be departing at the end of the next watch." "Very well, Captain," says Schaefer. "Please inform me of any further news as soon as you can." "I will, Colonel Schaefer," the captain says before leaving. I turn to follow him, but the colonel calls me back. "The system is swarming with orc attack fleets," he says to me. "We're part of a 10-strong convoy that's gathered here to proceed to Armageddon with a light cruiser, that is, the Victorious, and 2 frigates as escort. I want the platoon on standby status in case of trouble. I have authorized you to have direct access to a weapons locker. Familiarize yourself in the platoon with the ship's layout and drill for contingencies, including boarding, counterboarding, incendiary control, and evacuation." He hands me a wad of schematics detailing a ship's decks, from engine rooms to bridge. "Is it really that bad, sir?" I ask, taking the papers. "It's about 20 days till we reach the fleet in Armageddon orbit," the colonel says. "No harm in being prepared. Have the platoon ready for my inspection before we leave." "Yes, sir," I reply, saluting and turning away. I stop and turn back to him again. "Orcs, sir," I say. "If they get aboard, I don't think we stand much chance at close quarters." "Then you make sure they do not get aboard," the colonel replies. I nod and leave, because there's nothing you can really say to that. As I close the door behind me, I catch a glimpse of a green robe further down the corridor. "Kelf?" I cry out. The figure turns, confirming that it is the navigator. He waits for me to approach. "Why are you here? This isn't a warp-capable ship." "There have been heavy casualties among the families aboard the fleet," says Kelth, Turning and walking down the corridor towards the steps leading to the bridge, there is an opportunity here for my house to assist in this shortage. Very honorable. Very honorable. Stepping into the breach and all that, I say, falling into step beside him. He stops and gives me a hard stare. Honor has nothing to do with it, Lieutenant Kage, he tells me. The standing of my house and the assurance of future prosperity is my only concern. You want to make a quick credit? I laugh. Millions are dying in space and on planets of this system, and you're concerned about profit? Very laudable, Lieutenant, says Kelth with no trace of sincerity. The Imperium is a fragile thing, which does not bear too much scrutiny. It is nothing more than the sophisticated interplay of political dynamics, mutual need, and self-interest. It survives because we need it, and we survive because it is there. The houses of the navigators are essential to its existence, and thus our dedication is duly rewarded. But what is it you actually do? I ask Kelth. We steer the ships through the Immaterium, he says. You know this, but how? I say, trying to keep up with his long strides. Think of a crystal of ice in an ocean, he says, slowing his pace, his gaze drifting to the ceiling in thought. It bobs on the surface, gets drawn down by currents, and if it should melt and become one with the ocean. That is how it is to navigate warp space. I don't understand, I say, my eyes straying to the scarf wrapped around his third eye. What is it you can see? Imagine a ship as a grain of sand, Kelly says. But when it drops into warp space, it is flung out on a huge desert. It is to be a part of that desert, just like the untold billions of other grains of sand. But when the winds shift and change, those grains of sand also move, forming valleys, drifts, hills, and shallows. Imagine, if you will, how that grain of sand would travel if it had a mind to steer itself into the winds it wished to follow and avoid the swirls and gusts that would take it from its path. I still don't know what you mean, I admit. That is my point, Lieutenant, he says. To explain the warp to one who cannot see it, to touch it, is like explaining light and sound to a deaf, blind man. I have senses you cannot comprehend. Some call it the third sight. But sight is such a basic sense in comparison. You cannot imagine the sensation of seeing the warp, of reading motions born of desires, sensing the fragile flicker of souls. You cannot understand it as much as I cannot understand why a man would want to be a soldier. We're about to enter the bridge, and he stops and looks at me. I'm wasting my time, he says. You have the soul of a soldier, but you need the heart of a poet to understand the immaterium. Describing colors to blind men is child's play in comparison. I let him walk into the bridge and try to work out what he has been telling me. No, I mutter after some time. I still don't get it. The convoy proceeds as normal for 8 more days, during which we practice anti-conflagration drills, close quarters boarding combat, and all the other things that are essential to space travel. The colonel tells us that we're just passing Chausin, the 5th planet out from Armageddon. We should reach Armageddon's orbit in about 20 days. Unfortunately for us, despite the stretched patrols of the Imperial Navy, the orcs are still very much active in the system, and a group of them comes out of hiding over Chausin and comes after us. I put the platoon on ready, and when I'm convinced, I take a quick tour of the ship. The bridge doors are open, and the crew seems busy, so I figure nobody would mind if I slipped out and figured out what was going on. Captain Linger and the colonel are standing in the center of the small chamber, deep in discussion. Arrayed like a horseshoe, the bridge is filled with panels and banks of screens and dials, attended by various uniformed officers and dribbling servitors. There's no other source of light, so the whole chamber is bathed in a multicolored glow, creating an eerie scene. Everything seems busy, but calm at the moment. A static broken screen on the front wall displays the convoy's positions with blue circles. Projected courses are outlined in dots. I guess the series of dark red runes to the far right of the screen are the Orc Raiders. Have we got relay from the Victorious yet? Have we got relay from Victorious yet? The captain asks, an officer stationed at a panel to his left. Not yet, sir, the lieutenant replies, trying to work out whether it's transmission or reception that's its fault. Perhaps they could route through St. Kale, suggests the captain, the comms officer nodding in agreement. That's the closest ship to us, sir, the lieutenant says. I'll hail Captain Mendez. Good, says Linger, turning back to the colonel. I hear someone stand next to me and turn to see Kelth, noticing the holstered pistol at his belt. Can't comprehend what it is to be a soldier, I say, looking pointedly at the sidearm. He glances down. Purely for self-protection, he says, looking directly at me. Ever fired it before? I ask, avoiding his deep gaze by looking back at the main screen. In duels, not in combat, he replies, his voice soft. What's happening? I say to change the subject. Only nobility has the pleasure of dueling. A form of combat is different from the dirty knife fights of my youth, as the coming space battle. The data on the screen is almost half an hour old. Kelth tells me, crossing his arms and leaning up against the dormant panel behind us. The strategic information from the Victorious has been interrupted. Damage from enemy fire? I say, casting a glance at the colonel, who's bent over a chart with Linger, pointing and talking in a low voice. No, the fighting hasn't started yet, Kelth says. The orcs are coming in fast and straight, but it'll still be another hour before first contact, unless the escorts turn to meet them. Will that work? I ask, noticing for the first time a servitor wired into the wall beneath the screen. It's chanting something in a monotonous tone, too low for me to make out above the humming of the bridge equipment and the throb of the engines that are powering into full life now. Kelth notices the direction of my stare. It's a comm servitor, explains the navigator. It relays and records all traffic received and transmitted across the convoy frequencies. And no, in answer to your question, the frigates and Victorious are not capable alone of preventing a flotilla of 6 orc raiders breaking through into the convoy. Could they buy us time to get away? I ask. Unlikely, the navigator replies. The ship is a little faster than the others, but there are a few ships in the convoy that would get run down within a few hours. So, what do you reckon they'll do? I say. My brow furrows as I look at Schaefer, arguing quietly with the captain. Perhaps he's advocating that we make a run for it and leave the rest of the convoy to its fate. The Victorious can outgun any one or two of the enemy, Kelth says, stroking his chin. The frigates will try to ensure that they stay in support of her. The orc ships are generally not very maneuverable at speed. They'll have to attack in a series of passes. The frigates will try to herd them into the light cruisers' guns, one or two at a time. And how easy is that to do? I ask, feeling that I already know the answer. Commodore Griffin is experienced at convoy duty, or so I hear from the command crew. Kelth tells me with a thin smile. The Emperor wills. He does, doesn't he? I mutter, turning my attention to the quiet hubbub of the bridge. I just wish he didn't wield against me all the time. After another 15 minutes, the comms problems are overcome by some ingenuity, and I suspect a lot of shouting and swearing by some poor bastard elsewhere in the fleet. The updated positionals appear on the screen, and I can't really make sense of them. I hear a low series of groans and sighs from the various members of the bridge crew. A problem? I ask, turning to Kelth, but he's gone. He must have slipped away while I was distracted. I have a fleet communication from Commodore Griffin, announces the comms lieutenant. Well, let's hear it then, snaps Captain Linger. There's actually a Navy task force with the cruisers Holy Wrath and Torch of Retribution about 2 days away, the lieutenant says. Would proceed to the enclosed position and meet up with them. 2 days? I blurt out. And all eyes turn to me. The colonel raises an eyebrow, having noticed me for the first time. Why are you here, Kage? He asks. I wanted to keep the platoon informed of the ongoing situation, I reply, thinking quickly. The eyebrow raises even higher. I will pass on information as I see fit, Kage, he says. I just look at him with a pleading expression, unable to come up with any better reason than I have, because I'm curious. He glances and gives me a long, hard look, and then shakes his head in irritation. Very well. You could stay for the moment, he says eventually, but do not interfere again. No, sir, I won't, I say with a shake of my head. It's a mobile delaying action, Zen, says Linger. I hope the orcs don't have any reinforcements close by. Is that likely? Not really, says the ship's captain. Orc communications are unreliable. They tend to stay in close packs. Otherwise, they end up scattered all over the place. It's when their ships are mobbed up in that fashion that they are the most dangerous. The crew bustle around for a few more minutes, and I start to lose interest until the captain glances at the screen. Hold on, he says, catching the colonel's attention. The orcs are making their first move. The blinking icons representing the orc attack ships start to move around on the top of the screen, attempting to flank the convoy to port. The frigates and light cruiser move to intercept, turning inside the orc ships. Which ship is that? The colonel asks, pointing at a solitary blue circle split off from the main cluster of the convoy ships. The Spirit of Galthamore, sir, replies one of the lieutenants from a position in the forward and right. Oldest bucket in the merchant flotilla, mutters Linger. Emperor knows how Lysander keeps her going. She must be at least 700 years old by now. Another few minutes pass as we watch the escorts cut off the orc attack, one of them detaching to shepherd the Spirit of Galthamore back to the main fleet. The orcs slow and allow the convoy to get ahead of them before cutting back and trying to cross the stern of the flotilla. Again, the Victorious and her companions head off the attack, interposing themselves between the attacking ships and their transports. Kelth appears again and glances at me. Are all the battles in space this dull? I ask him, and he shrugs. This is my first. I wouldn't know, he says. I would rather it was dull than exciting, though. I expect excitement in a space battle is pretty dangerous. I nod and turn my attention back to the screen. The orcs, despite Linger's words, have split into pairs, one for each of the 3 ships. One continues to harass the starboard flank, while the other drives straight for the rear of the convoy. I look at Linger. He doesn't seem concerned in the least. He stands leaning over the back of his chair, glancing now and then at his comms officer. The flickering icon of the Victorious breaks away from the frigates and heads towards the flanking groups, steering ahead of them. The frigates keep their distance from the attacking group, staying with their broadsides to bear, but out of range. Aren't they the biggest threat? I blurt out, earning a scowl from the colonel. Linger turns to look at me. Just watch, the captain says with a confident smile. My attention is fixed to the screen when I hear the comms officer. Victorious has announced torpedoes launched. the lieutenant says, and a new icon appears on the screen. Its projected line intersecting the starboard orc ships a few minutes from now. Her payload launched, the Victorious slows suddenly and almost turns around completely, powering up her engines to cut through the heat of the convoy towards the other orc squadron. The orc ships slow and turn away to avoid the torpedoes, and several minutes later, they're falling behind. The frigates close in on the orc squadron as the Victorious approaches from the other side. Cunning bastard, I mutter. Seeing the orcs are in some classic crossfire. The light cruiser and frigates are attacking at right angles to each other, and the Victorious's course takes her across the vulnerable sterns. Frigates have open fire, announces the comms lieutenant. Report light damage to one ship, no hits on the others. The frigates close their range as the orcs desperately try to turn towards them. Orc ships have most of their guns to the front, explains Linger. They should have stayed on course and come for us. Now, they're in a turning race they cannot win. Sir, Victorious is sending details of a new contact, snaps the comms officer, making adjustment to the screen controls. A solitary icon appears in the middle of the transport flotilla. A ship can't just appear, I say, looking at the lieutenant, who ignores me. He's intent on the information being relayed from his earpiece and through the comm servitor. Space goes up and down as well as forward, backward, left and right, says Kelth, shaking his head in a condescending manner. You mean they're above us? Or below us, he says, looking down at the decking. Give me an intercept time, says Captain Linger, moving across the bridge to another station where a fresh-faced young ensign is analyzing the incoming data. 30 to 35 minutes, given current velocities, the ensign replies, pointing to something on his panel. Linger looks over his shoulder at the main screen. Enemy destroyed, announces the comms lieutenant. A red icon disappears from the screen to the starboard of the light cruiser. Full broadside from the Victorious. The Victorious is still engaged with the other two of the squadron, while the group of 3 ships to the flank has managed to pull out of its course away from the torpedoes. It swings around to the front of the convoy. If they get ahead of us, I mutter, and Kelth gives me a worried glance. How come you've never been in a battle before? The Emperor wills it, he replies. He has seen fit to guide me along the brightest trail. I say nothing. The Emperor has seen fit to have the Colonel drag me through several lifetimes' worth of blood, mud, and filth. The Colonel walks over to me. How prepared are we for boarding? He asks. As ready as we'll ever be, I tell him. A platoon that is under strength isn't going to be much use against a ship full of orcs, though. Better than just the ship's complement, he says. This is the only troop transport in the convoy. Sir, I don't think this is our fight, I say, looking straight at him. You haven't told us what we're going to do on Armageddon yet, but I am sure that if it's important enough to drag us across the galaxy, it's important enough that we don't sacrifice ourselves for a few grain and mineral transports. He gives me a long, hard look. Our duty is always to the Emperor, he says slowly. That's not what happened on Cragmere, I remind him. The Colonel risked his reputation pulling us out of the front line against the orcs in the ice world so that we could continue to Typhos Prime and attack Court Norum. That was different, he says, returning my gaze. How so? I ask, not flinching. There were many other Imperial forces to hold the line, he tells me. Our presence or lack of it would have had no impact on the campaign. There is no other line of defense for the convoy. Did you ever hear what happened in the end? I ask, a thought suddenly occurring to me. I've been in a dozen war zones on various missions with the Colonel, but we rarely hang around long enough to find out who's won. The campaign is still progressing, he tells me. Besides, we are just as at risk from attack if we separate from the convoy. Not if we head for the rendezvous with the task force, I point out. The orcs will pounce on us if we isolate ourselves, the colonel says. The Victorious and the frigates are the only protection we have, and they will not abandon the convoy for us. I look away from him, admitting the logic of the argument. How many orcs are on those ships? I ask, looking at the main screen and the flashing red icon of the newly arrived orcs vessel. The crew probably numbers in its hundreds, he says quietly. And we've got less than 30 million, I say. More if you conscript non-essential crew and the 4 surviving provosts under my command. That's not much against hundreds of orcs, I say. If they attack in force, we'll be overrun in minutes. Captain Linger joins us. What are you two conspiring? He asks, switching his gaze back and forth between the two of us. Please place your ship to intercept the attack on the fleet, the colonel tells him. He is answered by the captain's doubtful look. I don't see what good that will do, he says. He points to the main display. Our only chance is to maneuver for time and wait for the escorts. The Commodore has dispatched one of the frigates in our direction. How many vessels are armed? Every ship has close defense turrets. The Yarick and Bonifales have a few bigger guns, he tells us. It doesn't matter though. Just a few salvos from that orc ship would be enough to destroy any one of us. The colonel looks thoughtful for a moment, then turns to Linger. Is there a council channel to the rest of the fleet? He asks. I can have one arranged, including the warships, says Linger. Then do so, and inform me when it is ready, says Schaefer. The captain looks dubious for a moment, but soon melts under the colonel's gaze. Kage, come with me. Captain, if you could join me in the wardroom when you are ready. He marches off the bridge, leaving me trailing in his wake. Linger directs an inquiring look at me, but all I can do is shrug. In the wardroom, the colonel outlines his plan to Captain Linger and me. I stand there, speechless, with incredulity. Well, do you think you can manage that? He asks. That's the best way of getting yourself killed I've heard of in a long time, says Linger, shaking his head. Welcome to my life, I mutter, earning myself a scowl from the colonel. Is it possible? The colonel says. You're asking for good close quarter steering, says Linger. The only other military crew in the fleet is aboard the Yarick. The other ships have a mercantile company. I can't vouch for their abilities. But you agree that it is possible? Insists Schaefer. The captain sighs. Yes, Colonel, he says. I can't see how the others will agree, though. They will agree because Commodore Griffin is going to invoke certain clauses of the Naval Articles of Warfare, says the colonel. However afraid the other captains are of the orcs, I am sure they would rather face them than a military execution. I see, says Linger. We have about 20 minutes to arrange matters. I shall transmit your attention to the fleet. Schaefer watches the captain's back for a moment as he walks out, and then turns his attention to me. You will need to be ready in 10 minutes, he says, and I nod. You understand your mission? Of course, sir, I say heavily. Everyday duties of a last chancer, sir. You want me to lead an attack on a ship with 40 men, disable its engines, and then return. Not a problem at all, sir. Your enthusiasm is noted, Kage, the colonel says, dismissing me with a wave of his hand. Great, I think, as I head down the corridor at a trot. Now all I have to do is explain this to the platoon. We're assembled on the docking platform when the provosts join us. Like us, they're geared up in vac-proof environment suits, gray, bulky, and hot. They'll be the only thing protecting us from the chill airlessness of space once we break through the hull of the Orc ship. I have been ordered to report to you, one of them says. I can hear the grudging tone in his voice, even through the visor. What's your name? I ask, looking him up and down. Sergeant First Class Kale, he says. And I think you'll find I'm a lieutenant, Sergeant, I say to him. Proper form of address and all that. He raises the visor of his helmet, revealing a craggy face with a long scar running from his left ear across his mouth to his chin. His dark eyes meet my gaze. I don't care if you're a trooper or a general, he says between gritted teeth. You're penal allegiance scum to me, and that's the end of it. Don't push it. I like a man with principles, I say with a grin. I want you up front with me when we attack. I'm sure you watch me back, won't you? I understand the objective. We'll do our part, he says with a sneering smile. Just so that we understand each other, Sergeant, I say with a meaningful nod. We eyeball each other for a few seconds until the colonel strolls to the deck. Sergeant Candlerick barks out the order, and the platoon snaps to attention. I notice the holstered bolt pistol at the colonel's belt, and his power sword hanging from its scabbard on the other side. Oh, and the fact that he's also wearing a vac suit gives the game away. Joining us for this little jaunt, sir? I ask. I will lead the attack, he says, casting his eye over the platoon. Each is carrying a shotgun, a bandolier of ammo too. 3 men in each squad also have a sack of grenades, while the sergeants each have a demolition charge. So, we're still gonna do this then, I say with a sigh, stooping to pick up my vac suit helmet. It is too late to alter the plan now, the colonel says. The Yarick is moving into position as we speak. And how long before the frigate arrives? I ask, knowing I won't like the answer. 20 minutes is the earliest, the colonel says, not looking at me. You seem unduly worried, Cage. Unduly? I laugh. We're about to use a ship as bait to lure an enemy ship in, then attack it with transports. Then you are going to lead a platoon to attack the same enemy ship in the hopes of disabling its engines. I think some worries do, sir. You expect us to fail? Not at all, sir, I sigh. That's not the problem. We always succeed. The problem is, the more we push our luck, sooner it's going to run out. Perhaps we should have been saving it for Armageddon. You think some strange things, Cage, the colonel says. Luck has no part to play in your life. It is the will of the Emperor, whether you live or die. I just wish he would make up his mind, I think. A lieutenant appears. He walks up to Schaefer and salutes. The captain reports that we are now simulating engine trouble, sir, the Navy officer says. It appears the orcs are taking the bait. Thank you, Lieutenant, Schaefer says before turning to me. Mount up the platoon, Cage. I shout the order, and the sergeants hurry the men into the shuttle. It's the only one the ship has, so I suppose it stays in one piece. Otherwise, this is going to be a one-way trip, a short one at that. Once we're inside the shuttle, belted up and ready to go, the pilot appears at the door to the carriage compartment. We're ready to go in 30 seconds. I watch the rest of the platoon as the engines power up. I can feel their apprehension, nervous excitement, and fear. Dunmore is laughing with Cardinal, and I can hear the nervous edge to it. Candlerick has his head bowed in a prayer, as do some of the others. Morin is checking the slide on his shotgun for the 10th time, I reckon. Radso is fidgeting with the bolt shell pendant he wears. Supposedly it's a good luck charm, since it hit him in the shoulder but failed to detonate. When it was extracted, he had the armor disarm it for him. Now he wears it as a talisman. Here I sit there watching them, listening to the noise of the engines increasing in volume and pitch. With a lurch that pins me to the seat, we lift off, powering out of the open bay. The pilot then cuts the engines into reverse for a moment, and then completely off. We start to drift slowly away from the ship. The pilot's voice crackles over the ship's comm system. The captain's just told me that we're less than 5 minutes from contact. I turn to the colonel, who's sitting to my right. What if they just open fire? I ask. Maybe they don't want to board. They're raiders, he replies. They want to capture this ship and its cargo, not destroy it. They will board. But if they don't, I insist, then we can thank the Emperor that we are out here in the shuttle rather than a boarded ship, he says, and I laugh. He gives me a look and I chuckle. It's a tense few moments as we sit there in the shuttle, drifting through space, as easy as a firing range target. If the orcs spot us, which is unlikely, I admit, we won't even survive long enough to know it. I grab my helmet from under the seat and place it over my head. With a twist, I fit it into place and then turn to the colonel, who's returned from the cockpit. I point to the ceiling clamps. He fastens them for me and then puts on his own helmet and signals for me to fasten the clamps. Comms check. The colonel's voice echoes in my ear with a tiny note. A series of affirmative replies come back from platoon, and I add my own. Ready for disembarking, the colonel says, and we all stand up and march clumsily to the rear doors. I cross my fingers, if I could, but the suit won't let me. Slipping the shotgun on its strap from my shoulder, I chamber around and glance at the others. I see my face reflected in the black visor of one of Kale's provosts, obscured by the condensation buildup of my own sweat inside the faceplate of my suit. Hey, Provy, looking forward to your first real combat? I ask. He swivels towards me, his shotgun leveled at my groin. I hope my finger doesn't slip with my inexperience, he says, stepping forward. I'd hate to have a nasty accident my first time out. He looks down and sees the tip of my gun angled up towards his chin. That would be terribly bad, I say. Look, shitmouth, I fought on Danus Secundus, he says, swinging the shotgun away. I don't need to prove anything to you. I shut up. We never went to Danus Secundus, but everything I've heard makes it sound like the colonel would have loved it. More Tyranids, a splinter fleet of Hive Fleet Kraken from Icar 4, turned into a rout. Only 20,000 men out of 3 million got off alive. The number of non-combatants who escaped the 3-month onslaught amounted to about a tenth of that. 3 months is all it took for a world to die. Makes me glad we won on Icar 4. Hold on, says the pilot over the internal speakers. Emperor's blood. I look out of the canopy, seeing a slowly spinning field of stars. After a moment, the orc ship comes into view, its bulbous nose studded with cannons and jutting spars. A blue flare grows from its engines. It's about 20 kilometers away, but I can see that, oddly enough, it seems to be painted red. What looks like columns of flame are pouring from underneath the ship, and as I watch, a series of detonations explode along its length. I look at the colonel and then the pilot. The Yarick is reporting a previously unregistered energy spike, the pilot informs us. What does that mean? Asks the colonel, his voice in my comms transmitter, but distorted from the external speaker at the same time. Someone else was lying in wait, systems offline to avoid detection, the pilot says. They were playing dead, basically. Who? I ask. The pilot is listening to the fleet frequencies, his eyes widening with surprise. Space Marines, he says, staring out of the shuttle canopy as another series of explosions tears the Orc attack ship to pieces, its midsection breaking clean through. The two halves tumble away from each other, gouting gas and flames. Rapid strike vessel Termatum of the Black Templars. The colonel unbuckles his helmet and takes the comms piece from the pilot. Holding it to his ear, he nods to himself as he absorbs what's going on before turning to me. Stand the platoon down, Kage, he says, and I realize I've been holding my breath. I release it after a long sigh. Schaefer looks at the pilot. Take us back to the ship. It turns out that the Black Templars who have been hunting this particular band of orcs have been doing so for the last couple of days. They knew they were lurking near Chao Sin, but were unable to locate them. Hearing that the convoy was passing their way, they decided to lie in wait, thinking the orcs would be unable to resist the lure of transports. As well as the Termatum, there are two more rapid strike vessels and a strike cruiser, all within an hour's travel of our position. With the Space Marines as an additional escort, it's an uneventful journey to the inner system. We rendezvous with another fleet at St. John's Dock before we press on to Armageddon itself. The buzz around the fleet is that a new Orc Hulk has arrived in the system in the last week or so, but nobody's found it yet. It's a cautious approach to the Armageddon orbit. Despite the fleet's victories, there are still hundreds of Orc vessels unaccounted for, some of them large and dangerous. Added to that, it seems the Orcs have captured one of the rocket factories on the surface and have been randomly launching warheads into space, adding to the general fun. We've just entered upper orbit, and Captain Linger informs Colonel that a small, previously uncharted asteroid field lies across our line of descent. Schaefer agrees to navigate the asteroid field, using it to cover our approach until we hit lower orbit. The hope is that the Orcs won't be aware until it's too late to launch any form of attack. Playing it safe, Linger orders the transport to be cleared and braced for combat, while he edges us into the asteroid field. I'm on the lower deck with Dunmore and Laurie, securing energy cells near the engine room. The rest of the platoon is on various other duties throughout the ship, under the supervision of the provosts. Laurie's just passing me a final fuel canister, and the deck trembles under my feet. I look at the others, and their bemused expressions confirm that they felt it too. We exchange glances as I cautiously lower the fuel cell into the deck. The ship shudders again, more violently this time, sending the cells spinning out of my hand and clattering across the ship deck. A moment later, an alarm klaxon rings across the ship, deafening us as it squalls from a speaker just overhead. There's an explosion in the engine room behind us. A blast wave sweeps through the open doors along the corridor, hurling us from our feet. With the screeching twist of metal, part of the roof collapses and smoke starts to billow out of the ventilation system. The savior pods! I scream to the others, dragging myself to my feet. We're under attack. There's no mistake about that. I don't know how, and I don't care. It's obvious that we've already been taking critical damage. We won't survive another 5 minutes. I race off the corridor, with the other two trailing me. I vault up the stairs two at a time until another impact causes me to lose my footing. I stumble, then fall backwards. Brownie sticks out an arm and stops me. Flames in the ventilation duct reflect off his bald head as he helps me to my feet, grinning. That one's for taking care of Gorin, he says, pushing me forward. I nod and start hauling myself up the steps again. Laurie's in front of me. Reaching the middeck, we're confronted by carnage and chaos. The walls are buckled, supporting rafters hang down from the ceiling, several cables spewing sparks and oil. The air is filled with smoke. I can see at least half a dozen bodies crushed underneath the mess, pools of blood glinting as they spread across the decking. Their charred uniforms identify them as last chancers. I guess they won't be going any further, but there's no time to spare them a second thought. A smoldering pile of crates that has dropped from the storage bay above blocks our way forward. What now? Asks Laurie, taking a step back as an oil hose ignites, sending a jet of flame scorching across the corridor just a few meters in front of her. We keep going up, I say, pointing to the stairwell on the other side of the corridor. Brownie forges ahead up the stairs, sweat dripping from him, to the nearby flames. My shirt is sticking to my back as I feel the heat licking up the stairs after us. Glancing over my shoulder, I see the flames spreading to the foot of the stairwell behind Lori. Faster! I yell, slapping Brownie on the back to urge him on. The spiral staircase is littered with 2 more corpses, crude this time, which we have to jump over. Smoke is all around us as we burst in the top deck. The flashing red lights of the savior doors stretch out in front of us. Most of them have already been ejected. I see a green light a little further on and lead the others to it, stepping over snaking wires and smoldering bodies. We're a couple of meters from the door when the colonel appears, heading from the opposite direction. With him are Kelth, Din Krug, Sergeant Candlerick, and another last chancer called Ohebs, who joined the last chancers with Lori. The colonel waves us into the savior capsule, and his bolt pistol glancing over his shoulder. 2 more figures appear out of the gloom. As they emerge out of the darkness and smoke, I see it's Cutthroat, one of the Navy ratings. Behind him, cowering from the flames, is Spooge, his servo skull still obediently bobbing along behind him. The polished bone is tarnished with soot and oil now, and its anti-grav motors sputter and choke occasionally, causing it to dip alarmingly towards the floor. I watch them all jump into the pod, and then duck inside in front of the colonel. We each slump down into one of the tin seats, laid out in a circle around the hull of the capsule. The main control panel juts down from the ceiling in the center, while the retro rockets and parachute take up most of the floor space between us. It's cramped, but we manage to strap ourselves in as the colonel cycles the door closed and sits down. Before pulling on his straps, he leans forward and activates the countdown launch sequence. He grunts and stares at the panel for a moment before looking up at me, then Cutthroat. There seems to be a problem with the electrics, he says, prodding the runes on the display. Cutthroat unbuckles himself and stands to have a look. He shakes his head a few times, muttering under his breath. My stomach starts to churn. I can see fluttering hints of yellow through the small circles in the porthole. The connection's broken, Cutthroat declares, spitting on the deck. There's a manual launch on the deck. Cage, get to the manual launch and activate it, says Schaefer, not even looking at me. Why me? I say, crossing my arms stubbornly. I always get this kind of shit. Send Cutthroat. He knows what he's looking for. The colonel doesn't even look up. Cage, get to the manual launch and activate it, he says again. I notice the pistol in his hand pointing straight towards me from his lap. Before I shoot you. For Emperor's sake, I always end up doing the hard work. I unstrap myself and cycle the door lock. Give me a fragging hand, Cage. Silence the fragging women, Cage. Fragging eat the brains, Cage. I continue swearing as I step out on the deck. The heat from the fire is nearly unbearable. I cough heartily from the smoke gathering on the corridor. I put my head back into the capsule. Where is it? I ask Cuthard. He gestures along the deck. It's about 15 meters down. A red trim panel. You can't miss it. Just pull the trip switch and get back here in 30 seconds. The door will close automatically. Right. 30 seconds, I say, heading off to a trot. Cuthard is right. The panel's easy to spot. Unfortunately, piping has collapsed from the ceiling ducts. I wrench the piping away and pull on the lever. There's a warning siren, and a bright red light begins to blink just below the lever. Just as I'm about to turn down the capsule, a dark figure appears out of the smoke. I recognize Cale, the provost sergeant. He's without his helmet, and his face is half burned. His hair is smoldering. He has a shotgun in his hands. What are you doing? He demands, grabbing hold of me. Emergency launch! I snap at him, throwing off his hand. You've got about 20 seconds to get in the capsule. He nods and shoulders his way past me, pushing me against the wall. The metal is hot and sears my hands, and I push myself upright. It's then I realize he's heading to the open pod. There's only one seat left, and that's mine. A swift kick between the legs from behind me. A swift kick between the legs from behind connects with Cale's prized possessions, toppling him forward into a crumpled heap. I snatch the shotgun from his hands and ram the butt of it into his face, driving him to the deck. He makes a half-hearted grab for my ankle, but I slip past, heading for the capsule door. Bastard! He shouts after me, and I give him a look as I duck through the door. The colonel looks at the shotgun in my hands, eyebrow raised. Ignoring him, I hurl myself into the remaining seat and drag the harness across my shoulders, ramming the lockdown into the seat socket between my legs. The door grinds shut and locks itself, while the ejection motors grumble into life below our feet. I see Kale's twisted, shouting face appear in the door window for a second before the pod is launched upwards, punching out of its ejection tube into space. The force rams us all down to our seats, and I grit my teeth against the pressure. The blood rushes to my legs, making me feel dizzy. Out of the corner of my eye, I hear Spooge collapsing inside his harness. He's blacked out as the retro fires. Free of the artificial grav of the ship, we tumble in weightlessness, straining in the safety straps. After a few moments, I heave a massive sigh of relief. What the frag? I finally say, looking at the colonel. He doesn't reply for a while. The asteroid belt was not safe, he says eventually. Most of them were the rock forts Commissar Great warned us of. They opened fire as soon as we were in range. Cuthbert is busying himself with the short-range comms unit fitted to the Savior Pod's control panel. I unharness myself and guide myself over to the viewing portal on the door. I can see the burning remnants of the ship, and it suddenly occurs to me that I never knew its name. There are other explosions and trails of fire as the orcs launch attack craft to hunt down the surviving Savior Pods. Not so far away, I see the glinting reflection of another capsule, a moment before a missile detonation engulfs it. All around us, missile trails zoom past, probably kilometers away, but too close for comfort. Among the debris, I see charred bodies, clumped in groups, as they are blown out of the ship by hull breaches. They slowly freeze together. Everything dwindles away as we drift from the battle. Soon all I can see are the distant sparks of engines and the ominous shadows of the rock forts, blotting out the views of the stars beyond. Moments later, I can't even see them. We're gonna die, Cothard says, his voice shrill. There are only 2 other capsules left. The orcs are gonna hunt us down. Shut up, snaps Lori. She turns to her right, where Erasmus is unconscious, and tries to revive him. There's no gravity to support us. So the quill scroll is nestled in the scribe's lap, buzzing erratically. Shut up, says Cuthred. The beacon isn't working because the transmitter was fragged on launch. We're also getting pulled down into the gravity well. Even if the orcs don't get us, and we manage to avoid being burned up on entry to the atmosphere, we're going to crash Emperor knows where. Stop whining, I say, still staring out of the window. I can't see any fire that's directed in our area, or the telltale flickers that might be closing attack craft. We'll be fine. We are not going to be fine, says Cuthred, and I turn to see him sneering at us. You don't understand. It's not a war zone down there. It's hell. We might get lucky and actually land on solid ground. Then all we have to worry about is perhaps freezing to death if we land in the poles or dehydration. Maybe we'll land in a war zone or in a chem pit. We might get fortunate enough and just be killed by orcs. We have no weapons, no survival gear, no comms. Even if we landed near Imperial forces, there's no way of knowing or forcing them to find us. We're as good as dead. Cage, silence him. The boom of the shotgun is unbearably loud in the confines of the pod. The recoil sends me crashing to the floor and bouncing back. The remnants of Cuthred drift around the air, globules of blood and brains spattering everywhere against my face and chest as I glide through the cloud of gore. Everyone's looking at me, aghast, except for the Colonel and Lori. That's out of order! That's out of order! Shouts Candlerick, but falls silent as I steady myself and the muzzle of the shotgun swings in his direction. He glances at Schaefer for a reaction. Our first priority is survival, the Colonel says slowly. Doubt and fear compromise our chances of success. Everyone here is subject to summary execution for cowardice under military law. Once our immediate survival is no longer an issue, We will proceed with our mission to the best of our abilities. That's no surprise. Losing three-quarters of our force is just a minor setback when you're with the last chancers. For years, I've been explaining how psychers see the warp, and I realize now that I've kind of like bastardized it. Given it I haven't given it like its true majesty. I think that Kelth did a great job explaining how the psychers see in the warp, and yeah, it's actually better than I remember. It's like being one little like speck in a sand dune, like one little piece of dust, and trying to like guide yourself to the next sand dune without being blown away. There's also like quite a hearty dialogue regarding fleet combat, and I like how basically it's this terrifying combination of knowing and not knowing, of like having definites and then unabsolutes, and that reflects the fact that the ship isn't just like some third person entity. Like you can't like see like from the ship. Like the ship has sensors and like a sensorium and communication officers that have to relay information back and forth. It's I think that fleet battle was a fantastic ballet. And the whole time I was thinking like, how can they make the boarding action against the orcs different than the boarding action that had the dark elves in it, the space elves in it? And I was like, oh, they're gonna go board it. And I actually thought they were gonna do it. I forgot that the space marines just came and saved them. And that's kind of cool. I mean, it kind of shows what the Adeptus Astartes are capable of and what a huge impact they have just immediately. The next hour was probably the most terrifying of my life. Though I've been through some of the most emperor awful stuff you can imagine. Battlefields choked with the dead, and personal moments like the time a Tyranid warrior sawed halfway through my leg at Deliverance. The utter helplessness of our predicament sets my nerves jangling. Aided by Kelth, the colonel manages to at least get the automated telemetry working so that the capsule will take us down to the atmosphere at the correct angle, rather than bouncing off or burning us up. Well, in theory, the only way we'll know if they've really got it right is when we hit the upper atmosphere in about 15 minutes. I'm not the only one getting stressed out about the situation. Erasmus is quiet now, though he was gabbling nervously to himself a little while ago. He's just sitting there, cradling the servo skull in his hands and stroking it carefully, reverently. Lori is alert, her eyes continuously flickering from one of us to the other, her clenched jaw staying that way. Canoric fidgets with his buttons on his cuffs all the time, drawing little circles with his index finger on the dull brass hemispheres. Kindrug is pretending to be cool. He is sitting with his hands behind his head, eyes closed, but I see them half open occasionally, checking everything's all right before closing again. He's a drop trooper, so I guess this situation isn't as alien to him as it is the rest of us. But then again, there's a world of difference between plummeting on a savage into a savage war zone and an out of control savior pod, and grab shooting into a prepared DZ with a platoon of your comrades. Brownie's humming to himself and tapping out the beat of some regimental march on his knees. His eyes stare at the floor between his legs. As I watch him, he stops his little tune and pulls his combat knife from his belt. Immediately, I'm tense and ready, and I see Lori shift slightly in her seat, ready to act if he does anything stupid. Instead, he spits in his left hand and rubs it over his scalp, and then, carefully and slowly, scrapes the blade over his head, removing tiny protrusions of stubble which have appeared since he shaved his head this morning. He looks up at us, feeling our gazes on him. He lifts the blade away a little and shrugs, and turns his attention back to the floor as he continues to scrape the knife across his scalp. Gideon Ohebs is directly opposite me, and it's only by leaning slightly to one side that I can see him. I'm glad of that, because he absolutely freaks me out when I'm near him. I don't know what it is, but whenever I'm close, in proximity to him, I feel kind of giddy. It's hard to describe. It's like someone you dislike on first sight, even though you have no idea what kind of person they are. I've spent most of the last year avoiding being in the same room as him as much as possible. There's nothing physically wrong with the guy, and he's certainly one of the more quiet and obedient of the platoon. I correct myself as I think about this. There is no platoon. It's just us now. I feel a bit bitter about that in an odd sort of way. The last chancers, the real last chancers, are only ever a handful of soldiers. Maybe the colonel started out with a 4,000 strong legion a couple years ago, but the rest were just baggage, really. They were being tested, and only a few of us survived long enough to get to Court Norum. Ohabs is sitting comfortably, his hands clasped on his lap, gnawing at his bottom lip. I can see that his fingernails are worn and ragged too, so it's easy to see how he deals with his nerves. Beside him, Kelth squirms uncomfortably, casting looks at Ohebs every couple of minutes, brow knitted. So it isn't just me that finds him awkward to be around. And finally, there's the colonel, unflappable, unlovable, and unkillable. I can feel him on my right, like a rock. With parade ground stiffness, he just sits there, a hand on each knee, staring straight ahead. He doesn't even glance at the panel to check our progress. It's like he's deactivated on something, like a lasgun with the safety on, just waiting for someone or something to flick the switch and put him into action again. That said, I can see the subtle tick of his jaw muscles, the only sign I've ever noticed of stress or anger. Sensing my gaze, he turns his head slowly towards me, his icy eyes boring into me. He doesn't say anything, he just stares at me. How long before entry, sir? I ask, eager to break the crushing silence. 2.5 minutes, he replies, without needing to check the display. Any idea where we'll crash land? I say, leaning forward to look at the meaningless scrolling runes and numbers of telemetry panel. He breaks his stare to look at the display and then reaches inside his coat to pull out a battered looking map. He unfolds it, then refolds it, glancing at the coordinates glowing from the screen until he's found the area he wants. The good news is we will not likely land in water, he says, putting the map away. The bad news? There is a good chance that we will make planetfall somewhere in the jungles, he says. He doesn't have to add anything. From Great's briefing, we know that the jungle is teeming with orc activity, despite several fire missions to clear it out. Our only hope is that someone at Cerebus Space noticed us crash and sends out a search and rescue party. There's little chance of that, I reckon. With all the problems they have, I figure that a savior pod coming down is just going to be the last thing they're worried about. They're virtually under siege from the orcs, and I haven't got much better things. And I've got much better things to do with their time. Then there's the little chance of that, I reckon. With all the problems they have, I guess that a savior pod. That is assuming we do not get caught in an electrical storm and go off our current projected trajectory, the colonel adds. There are a few groans around the pod. One of them my own. Not for the first time, and probably not the last. I asked myself whether this was worth the satisfaction of killing my sergeant. In the great balance of things, I should have just let him have the girl. Still, regrets for the weak. I cast my own die, and the Emperor took the bet and left me here. So all I can do now is deal with it. I've long since stopped blaming anyone else for my predicament. It makes it so much easier to deal with. Once you stop looking elsewhere for the reasons why crap happens to you, you realize it's all your undoing, one way or another. Unfortunately, I guess that's one of life's little wisdoms that are denied to so many of us after we've made an important mistake. We don't normally get the chance to learn from it. The interior of the pod begins to heat up considerably, to the point where it starts getting difficult to breathe. We look at each other with consternation, wondering if this is a prelude to exploding into a ball of fire. The heat shielding tearing away, the metal casing melting, and our bodies vaporizing into nothing. The capsule begins to shake, jarring us from side to side. And we can really start to feel the pull of the gravity well and our own velocity. Candlerick starts swearing under his breath. Tinkrug laughs, and we all stare at him. If the atmosphere is thickened enough to make things turbulent, then we've entered okay, he says with a grin. Just the landing to worry about. Or maybe I should say impact. Thank you for pointing that out, mutters Dunmore, shaking his head. You really are a bonehead, aren't you? Kindrug laughs and shrugs. Then, seeing that we've not been sharing the joke, he points to Brownie's shining scalp. He's calling me a bonehead? Kindrug says. You want me to slap that smirk off your face? Says Dunmore, bringing his hand back across his chest to emphasize the point. The vibrations become more and more violent as we dive down to the sky of Armageddon, and then stop suddenly. For a couple of minutes, it feels like we're just floating, and then we hit the solid fume cover that fills Armageddon with thick clouds and turbulence. Not long now, says Dinkrug. Yeah, I like Kindrug, checking the bindings on his harness. Let's just hope the retros don't get fragged with the other systems, I say, earning myself scowls from the others. I'm just saying what we're all thinking, so don't give me that look. There's a tangible release of tension when the pod shudders, and a dull roar emanates from beneath us as the retro rocket fires. I can feel us slowing, the weightlessness of our descent disappearing. As the retros grow to full power, the deceleration pushes us downward into our seats, and I feel blood rushing to my head, making me feel dizzy. There's another jolt as the chutes open, and the retro burns off, leaving us, with any luck, drifting down to a not too speedy landing. A few minutes later, and the capsule hits slightly to the side, accompanied by the metallic clang of branches slapping and snapping against the hull. We shudder to a stop, and I'm slightly hanging to my left and the seat strap. There are a few creaks and groans, and I feel us settling a little more. Candlewick slaps the release on his buckle and pushes himself up. Wait, says the colonel, just as I'm opening my mouth, but we're too late. As Candlewick steps forward, the weight in the capsule shifts. There's no more snapping of branches. We just drop. I'm spinning to my left and pitching forward, and Candlewick is thrown clear across the pod, ricocheting off the central control column and smashing his head into the hole just to my right. His face explodes on impact, and his head snaps back. I don't hear anything over the crashing through the branches, but his body rolls across me and then falls away. His dangling neck, all the evidence that I need. His neck snapped as easily as the branches outside. With an impact that sends a shudder down my leg and along my spine and jars my head against the pod wall, we slam down to the ground. The pod rolls forward as it settles. We sit there waiting for further movement. I can hear Spooge whimpering out of the corner of my eye and see Brownie clenching and unclenching his fists, muttering under his breath. Kindrug is gripping tightly to his harness, head back against the wall. Gideon is staring at Candlewick's corpse, lying bunched up beneath his feet. Nervously, he kicks at it, but at the angle we've landed, it rolls straight back at him. I think we're done, says Laurie, looking at me and the colonel, who nods and undoes his straps. I notice him pulling out his pistol as he hauls himself up, using the display column. Undoing my own restraint harness, I fish the shotgun out from where I stowed it beneath the seat, tucked beneath one of the chair supports. I'm glad I did, because the last thing we needed was a loaded firearm tumbling around the pod as we fell. As the rest of them free themselves, the colonel pulls himself across the door, which is slightly higher than the ground, at a shallow angle. He peers through the condensation-covered porthole, looking outside. It appears to be that we are clear, he says. No immediate threat, at least. What's the plan? Asks Brownie, steadying himself with a hand on his seat and wriggling a kink out of his neck. The colonel turns and looks at each of us as he speaks. We secure a perimeter around the pod and make a further appraisal. What are we going to secure a perimeter with? Asks Kindrug. Apart from Cage's shotgun and your pistol, all we have are knives. The colonel tosses his bolt pistol to Kindrug, who catches the heavy sidearm awkwardly. I want you 20 meters out from the doorward, Cage. You are to position yourself on the opposite side, he says, gripping the door lock. Understood? I give him the nod and Kindrug follows suit after a dubious look. The colonel spins the lock and thrusts the door outwards. As it clangs against the hull, I let Kindrug out first. Even though I'm closest to the opening, if there is something out there waiting for us, there's no reason to be in a rush to greet it, I figure. The drop trooper clambers through, and I follow him a few seconds later, pulling myself out of the opening. I see that we've definitely landed in jungle, as if there was any doubt. The burned shell of the pod is resting on a litter of dried leaves and freshly broken branches. Leaping down to the jungle floor, shotgun in hand, I peel right and work my way around the other side of the pod. The two white shoots lie in tatters a few meters above us, hanging like signal flags from the trees. It's damn hot, and the air is thick with moisture. I'm already swearing and sweating with buckets, and it's difficult to breathe properly. There's an edge to the air that catches in the throat, making me feel as though I'm choking. It's pretty dark, too. Most of the light is coming through the hole in the canopy made by the crashing pod. Beyond the circle, the jungle looms dark, and other than the vague shapes of twisting trunks, I can't see anything beyond the 20-meter mark or so. Gigantic fungi erupt from warped roots and branches, and thin, thorny bushes somehow leach an existence from the dry ground. It's all deadly quiet. Any birds or beasts in the vicinity were obviously put to flight by our dramatic entrance. Seeing nothing, I bang on the pod with the butt of the shotgun. All clear, I say, not too loudly, because I don't want my voice to carry too far. I drive to a crouch and work my way forwards from the capsule, scanning left and right as I move. I'm moving slowly but surely, controlling the urge to just get in place and then burrow down. There's two things that are bound to attract noise. One of them is something absolutely still when everything else is moving. The other is quick movement, which will attract the eye faster than anything. Ever been jumpy? Ever been looking left and right constantly, thinking you saw something moving? That is pure survival instinct. And that's what I'm relying on right now. There's scattered undergrowth, clawing for life in the little light that gets through the mass of foliage above us. Dark, prickly bushes and trailing vines crisscross the jungle floor. As I settle down between the two trees, shotgun laid out in front of me, I do another quick scan ahead to see anything. But once I'm in place, an uneasy feeling starts to creep up my spine. Not a feeling, more of a memory. I can remember a planet called False Hope that I visited with the colonel. It was a jungle death world. A contact had been lost with the station there. What we found was one of the most fragged up, strangest things I've ever encountered. But you wouldn't believe it unless you were there yourself. The memories of that jungle fight, the smell of burning vegetation from the flamers, and the screaming of men being torn apart rushed back to me. I feel my finger over the trigger of the shotgun, ready to pull it into position. I hear the sound of footsteps behind me, but resist the temptation to turn around. I've been told to keep watch. Whatever else you think of me, I'm a bloody good soldier these days, and I do what I'm told. Whatever I'm told. The colonel says we're setting off, says Lori. I push myself to my feet and look back at her. Which way? I ask. She nods to the right. What's that way? It doesn't matter, she says with a shrug. She turns and starts to walk off. We haven't got a clue where we are anyway, so the colonel just picked a direction. Keep walking long enough. We'll find something to orient ourselves with. Fair enough, I say, slinging the strap of the shotgun over my shoulder and heading after her. The going is tough, and I'm seriously short of breath after just a few hundred meters. The colonel says that Armageddon's air is so full of pollutants that it can kill a man in just 3 days. We're lucky we landed in the jungle, where the trees make it a little more bearable. Out in the desert, we've been coughing and choking the moment we came out of the pod. With the thick air and the exhausting effort of wading through the dead leaves, uniform snagging branches, sometimes having to saw our way through vines with our knives, it's very arduous as far as marching goes. Things scuttle through the bush at our approach. Beetles the size of my fist, with glowing wings, buzz to and fro in the gloom. The shrieking and cackling of birds and branch dwellers hidden in the treetops announce our advance and destroy any chance of our going undetected. Brownie is up ahead and on point. I'm the man at the back. We're spaced out at 10-meter intervals. Well, most of us are. Kelth and Erasmus are walking in a pair in the middle of the group. The scribe's been well behaved since we came down. The motor's gone in his servo skull, but he insists on carrying it with him. So far, they don't seem to be slowing us up, but we'll see how long that lasts. We're not quite sure how long until last light. We'll have to allow plenty of time to find a good lying spot to make camp. I reckon we've still got a good couple of hours marching ahead of us. Although the going isn't great, there's no reason why we can't cover at least 10 kilometers before finding ourselves a bolt hole. As we go further, the jungle seems to take on a little more character. There are a few shallow streams and pools across our line of advance, and we're steadily working uphill. Although we scrambled in and out of gullies and depressions, I know it isn't my imagination. The climbs out have been higher than the routes in. The colonel advises us not to drink any of the water. Thousands of years of industry have contaminated pretty much everything on Armageddon. It's a wonder the jungle flourishes as it does. I guess sometimes plants know how to hang on to life just as much as a last chancer. Every now and then, Brownie indicates a particular feature, like a large exposed boulder, a small cave under a tree's roots, a particularly splendid splay of red fungus, or a fallen trunk. As he passes between two gargantuan trees, whose roots form an archway above him, Dunmore points to the ground again. Kelth drops back from Erasmus and falls in beside me. Why does he keep doing that? Meet in positions, I tell him. If we run into some kind of trouble and the colonel tells us to bug out, that's where we meet up. Just remember where the last rendezvous is. And if there's any kind of crisis, just head for it as best you can. Better tell Spooge too, in case he doesn't know. I will, he says, glancing over his shoulder behind me. Look, I say, giving him a shove. Get out of my fragging way. You're right in the line of sight. Sorry, he says, stumbling ahead. I shake my head as he catches up with Erasmus. Bloody amateurs, I mutter to myself, checking to the left and right as we continue on. We find an area of high ground, just as twilight is making it difficult to see more than 10 or 20 meters. The trees are sparser here, and so the undergrowth is a lot thicker, providing perfect cover to hide us from view. There's nothing to eat or drink, but despite the humidity, my throat is parched. I feel my stomach growling, empty as well. I hand the shotgun to Kin Drug, who's drawn first watch with Lori. The colonel's already sitting with his back against the tree root, his eyes closed, and he's breathing shallowly. I help Kin Drug scout out a good vantage point and nestled on the root of a tree a bit further down. The colonel will give me the tab when it's time to relieve you, I say, and Kin Drug nods and crawls into the lookout position, shotgun across his knees. I walk over to the other side of the hill and find Lori lying under the spreading thorns of the dark blue bush. The bolt pistol is under her right hand, just to her side, a few leaves scattered on top of it to hide it from view. You're being cautious, I say, nodding at the pistol. There's going to be barely enough light to see your hand in front of your face. Never mind enough to glean off metal. And thinking you can relax is one of the best ways I know of getting yourself killed, she replies, not turning around. You have to wind down some time, I say, sitting down next to her. Piss off, Cage, she says, not harshly, but with enough edge to her voice that I know she means it. She sounds more resigned than angry. Don't start pretending now that you cared. I open my mouth to answer, but think better of it. With a shrug, I push myself to my feet and walk back through the ferns and bushes to our camp. Spooge is near the colonel, sitting cross-legged in the dead leaves. The hatch of the bottom of his servo skull open. He's prodding around with his finger, a desperate look on his face. Spooge's skull, is cracked wide open, split asunder, his brains bulging out of the wound. I prod with my fingers, exploring its depths, pulling it apart. I lick the fluids off my fingers, enjoying the sensation of taste. The feel is rubbery in my hands, and I run my palm along the jagged edge of the broken skull to compare the harsher sensation. My sense of touch sends an ecstatic thrill through me. It is one of the immense pleasures that I enjoy. I giggle as the shard nicks the flesh around my own, and blood bubbles out to mix with the scribe's life fluid. I stumble, momentarily dizzy. Spooge looks at me with his watery eyes and smiles. There's a flicker of memory for an instant, something to do with Erasmus. I can remember the taste of blood, but can't place it. There's a rippling at the back of my head, and it just moves forward. But this isn't the crushing pain of a vision. It's just a pleasant little tremor that sets my skin tingling. Could you have a look at my skull, please? Says Erasmus, and I stand there looking at him for a moment, feeling the urge to laugh, though I don't know why. I suppress the notion and sit down to Erasmus. He offers me the servo skull, and I take it from him. It weighs more than I thought, but I'm amazed he's carried it with him this far. I look at him out of the corner of my eye, so he won't see me looking at him. I turn the skull over in my hands, pretending to examine it. He looks at me with eager expectation. I'm no Teak, I say, handing him back the lump of inert machinery. No, you're a soldier, aren't you? Said Erasmus, placing the quill skull on the ground beside him. Yes, I'm a soldier, I say, looking straight at him, trying to detect some kind of insult or criticism. What of it? Do you know that I used to want to be a soldier? He says. I shake my head. He could have wanted to be a globe for all I care. I had to follow my father, though. Did you know that? He says, with a quick glance around at the servo skull. Do you know the Departamento Minitorium? Do you know what they give? An extra surrogacy allowance if you father a son to assure your position after you've passed on to the Emperor? No, never knew that, I say. I was a scribe apparent for 35 years. Don't you think that's a long time to wait for your calling in life? He says. I have no idea, I tell him. I'm not sure, but I don't think I'm even 35 years old. It's never been much of an issue. I was a kid, then I was a factory worker, and then I was in the guard. You don't know how old you are? He asks, incredulously. I shouldn't be surprised by his reaction, after all. He does surround himself with numbers and figures every day. I think statistics and records are his lifeblood. You ever take a couple of years of transit, deviation, mistranslation, primary reference error? Oh, given a couple of years of transit, deviation, mistranslation, and primary reference error, you're not even 30 Terran standard years. I'm about to reply when I stop myself. I noticed something about what he just said. That wasn't a question, I say to him, turning full on face to him. What wasn't a question, he asks. Is that important? No, not important, I guess, I say to him, brow furrowed. It's just, well, you always, just what? He says, concern on his face. I always what? Have you ever talked by asking questions, I say, smirking to myself to see the reaction. I know he probably isn't even aware of it, but it's about bloody time he stopped. Have I always talked by asking questions? He asks, staring up at me with his wide, honest eyes. Do you think it would be strange if I didn't? Never mind, I say, standing up. Get some shut-eye. We'll be heading off before first light. How do you sleep in these conditions? He says, as I turn away. I stop and think for a moment before replying. I don't look at him when I speak. Close your eyes, I say. Try not to remember all the shit that's just happened to you. That usually does a trick for me. Dawn is just a glimmer above the treetops when we set out. I did my stint on watch around midnight, near as I could tell in the lightless, starless dump. Nothing happened. Brownie snored until the colonel gave him a kick. There were a few bats, or possibly night birds, flapping around the trees. I was sitting on a nest of ants for half the time and count myself lucky that the worst I got was the creepy sensation of having the little bastards in my clothes for a while. I've heard tales, one of them from False Hope, of insects that could poison or devour a man in a few minutes. I'll pay more attention in the future. It's a monotonous, grinding leg for most of the morning. Dehydration is becoming a serious problem. All the moisture in the air counts for bugger if all of it is on the outside. Combined with the acrid tang of the atmosphere, my throat's harsh and ragged by the time the colonel calls for us to stop 4 hours from marching. Kelth and Erasmus, who's still carrying that bloody skull, look completely done in. The rest of us aren't looking too great either. Wheezing, coughing up goblets of phlegm, drenching sweat, we take a short break on the overhang of a long, shallow ridge. The colonel uses a tree root to pull himself up the bank, and though I'm loath to miss any second of rest, I push myself to my feet and follow him. We can't keep pushing on like this, not without something to eat or at least drink, I say. Sir, I add as he glances at me, that icy stare of his. There is no way of telling how long we must survive on our own resources before we reach new supplies, he says. We must conserve what we have and not waste it on the outset. We'll make better time with a little something in our bellies and a drink, I say. There were enough rations in the pod for 2 days, I reckon. There's no harm in having some now before we set off. Very well. But we eat and drink on the march, he replies. He looks about to say something else, but is distracted by something through the trees. What is it, sir? I ask. He doesn't reply, so I follow his gaze. There's a darkness out there, but oddly better lit. It's about 200 meters away. A clearing, you think, sir? He grunts and looks back at me. Bring me my bolt pistol and get Laurie to bring the shotgun, he says. Tell the others to stay where they are while we have a look. I nod and jump back to the bank, passing on orders to the squad. They ask what the fuss is about, but I don't tell them anything. I don't really know for myself. It's just a clearing. Armed, we set off for the strange patch of sunlight, the colonel waving us down to a crawl as we get closer. Through the trees, I can see it is indeed an opening, with a bright yellow light pouring in from above. The clearing is actually the edge of the jungle. As we cautiously move forwards, we find the jungle filled with blackened, charred tree stumps and scattered trunks. Ash covers the ground ankle deep. Wandering through this blasted maze of destruction gets worse, and after about another kilometer, we come out into the direct sunlight. A massive open space is laid out in front of us, burned to the ground as far as I can see. In the distance, at the top of a rise, the light glints off metal, but it's too far to see what it is. Perhaps it's some kind of structure, but there is no way to be sure. We do a quick circuit, checking for any sign of tracks, but draw a blank. The colonel sends Laurie back to fetch the others, while we head into the open, keeping low all the same. Ash and charred wood crumbles underfoot as we make our way down the rim of the crater. Under the unfiltered sunlight, the heat is almost unbearably hot. I can feel it burning on my forehead and hands. The shotgun, which I took from Laurie before we left, gets very warm and is rapidly becoming uncomfortable to hold. I can see that the colonel has holstered his bolt pistol. Some kind of incendiary? I venture. It found its mark, whatever it was, the colonel says, kicking over a lump of charred branch. Underneath, gleaming in the bright light of a shattered piece of bone. Looks old, I say, crouching down and pulling it free. It's part of a skull, much thicker than a man's. It's orc. I toss the fragment back into the ash and begin to pace around. I find other bits and pieces that survive the attack. A long knife with a crudely serrated edge lies. A long knife with a crudely serrated edge lies next to the finger bones on the hand that was holding it. I see the muzzle of a gun protruding from underneath a shattered half log and eagerly dig it up. I let it drop from my fingers, disappointed to see that the rest of the pistol has fused into an unusable lump. I look over at the colonel, who's glaring into the sky, one hand shielding his eyes from the sun. We will be too exposed if we make for that, the colonel says, looking towards the glint of the distance. It will be best if we keep to the cover of the jungle. I don't think there's anything to keep up here, sir, I say, eager to get out of the sun that is beating on my head like a jackhammer on a half-plate press. We should move on. He gives the crater another quick sweep with his gaze, and then nods, heading off towards the edge of the jungle to our right. I glance back and see the others have caught up with us. They are looking around the massive crater with the same curiosity we had. We're moving out, I call to them, waving them onwards. As Brownie comes up to me, I toss him the shotgun. You can be on point. Get along. His bald head prickling with sweat, he stares dumbly at the shotgun for a second, and then sees my impatient look. He hawks and spits before heading off to jog ahead of the colonel. The inferno engulfs Dunmore, lighting him up like a candle. The stench, like burning swine, drifts on the smoke that fill my nostrils. He screams, choked and hoarse. But these are but a symphony to my ears. They are accompanied by the crackling of the flames. His skin blisters and tears, creating a circular pattern that is pleasing to the eye before the blood trails away. The fireball strips him down to muscle, the fat hissing and spitting off him with a delicious roasted haunch. Shriveling to ash, his muscles churn to powdery cinders that blow in the thermal of the fire, dancing motes of grayness that look like dark snow. His organs rupture as his bones crack and wither. Each popping noise is like a lover's kiss on my soul. His suffering emanates in palpable waves that send a shiver down my spine, arousing and satisfying. The last thing to go is his shining scalp. The last beads of moisture from his burning brain sizzling away into nothing. With a start, I open my eyes and see Oheb staring at me, his face full of concern. I don't remember closing my eyes. The light from the sun hurts, and the heat makes me dizzy. Despite that, a chill shiver runs along my spine. I swear it was a cold sweat if I hadn't started out at the bottom of my spine and worked its way up to the base of my skull. I think the heat's getting to me, I admit, waving away Gideon's frowning face. He lingers for a moment longer, his eyes seeming to be looking at a point somewhere inside my skull. Then he slowly turns away. A few steps on, he glances over his shoulder at me before passing on after Brownie and the colonel. Darkness Darkness finds us with no signs of Cerebrus base, so we set up another laying up point, this time in the hollow between the root systems of two immense trees. It is deep enough for a man to stand and not be seen from a couple of meters away. Following the routine of the night before, we set up the sentry points and allocate watches. I feel ever so weak now, as do the rest of us. Even the colonel is showing early signs of dehydration. We have only had a few sips of water every couple of hours to keep us going. I actually saw the colonel stop once and lean against a tree to get his breath back briefly. It doesn't sound like much, but when you've been with him as long as I have, you know. It must be getting bad for him just doing that. The colonel's the most stubborn, unstoppable southern orc you'll ever meet. I saw him with his arm blown off once, and it barely even slowed him down. Emperor knows how the hell he got a new one. I suspect the tech priest did something for him, but just what it was, I haven't a clue. I've only just closed my eyes after bedding down after first watch, when there's an urgent whisper in my ear. Moving slowly, I sit up to see the face of Ohebs right in front of me in the darkness. As I look at him, I feel a churning in my stomach. I tell myself it's just a dehydration, but I know it's really him. Movement, he says, gesturing over his shoulder with a thumb. I crawl across the floor of the dell after him and pull myself up the side next to the colonel. He has a pistol in his hand and is peering through the ferns along the edge of the hollow. I glance at Ohebs, and he hands me the shotgun without hesitation. The others are crouched under the overhanging roots, wide eyes staring at me out of the darkness. Not far away, perhaps 20 meters, I can see shadowy figures in the gloom. I can't make out much, just shifting shapes between the trees. Listening, I hear the soft crunching of the dead leaves underfoot. Not orcs. Not moving that quickly. He thumbs the safety catch of the bolter, the colonel. Perhaps no more than a dozen strong. This group passes about 15 meters in front of us. Behind me, I hear the scrape of a boot searching for footing. I resist the urge to glance back, knowing that a sudden movement might attract attention. Ours? I say in a low voice. It's little more than a breath. The colonel nods slowly. I can't understand why he's so damn paranoid if he reckons they're on our side. I don't want to be shot in the dark, he whispers, as if reading my thoughts. I understand immediately. I know that if I was one of the guys up there and we suddenly sprang up, my trigger finger would work quicker than my eyes. The colonel slowly reaches up with his hand and lifts an old twig from the jungle floor just in front of us. With deliberate care, he snaps it between his fingers. The noise is loud as a gunshot in the still night. The troops out there are good. I'll give them that. There's no sudden rush for cover, no hectic movement. Over the next few seconds, they simply melt from view. The vague silhouettes just vanish into the bushes and trees. I know they're still out there, and they're probably just as worried about what's going to happen in the next few minutes as we are. I wait, heart hammering in my chest, peering intently into the darkness. I can't see anything except the faint swishings of the wind through the ferns and long grasses. It's then that I feel something cold and hard press against the side of my neck. I let go of the shotgun, easing my hands away, and slowly turn my head to the left. There, just a meter away from me, an auto gun, still at my throat, is a jungle fighter. His eyes stare at me out of the camouflage across his face. He sprawled headfirst down the bole of one of the trees we were sheltering under. His free hand and toes are rammed into the thick cracks into the bark to hold himself in place. With a measured precision, the gun muzzle not wavering more than a centimeter, he spins himself around until his feet are on the floor. He winks at me and then makes a purposeful glance over my shoulder. I turn and look into the hollow to see the others with their hands up. There's 3 more troopers on the far bank, guns leveled at the rest of our squad. They notice my stare, and one of them points up. I follow the gesture with my gaze. As my eyes focus, I see the faintest glimmer from the scope right above us, and movement as my brain only recognizes. It's a sniper.